Imagine this. You're standing outside a royal chamber in Madrid. The year is 1661, and inside, the Queen of Spain is in labor. The palace is tense. Servants move quickly, murmuring in hushed tones. The Queen's cries echo through the halls, until suddenly, silence. Then the door opens. A midwife steps out, her hand shaking, her expression grim. She doesn't announce the birth of a healthy prince. She simply mutters, "Something's wrong." Inside, the Queen lies unconscious. Her newborn son, wrapped in fine cloth, looks sickly and silent. That child will become Charles II of Spain. Even at birth, something was clearly off. He was weak, his tongue too big, his jaw stuck out, and his limbs hung loosely. He couldn't nurse. He didn't cry. Still, everyone bowed. He was a Habsburg, after all, a royal. But deep down, everyone knew what they were seeing. This baby wasn't a miracle. He was a sign of trouble. Spain's ruling family, the Habsburgs, had spent centuries marrying only among themselves to keep their bloodline pure. But that obsession came at a cost. Generations of cousin marriages had left the family tree twisted inward. The result was visible. Charles was a consequence of that long chain of inbreeding. To understand how a child could be born in such a condition, we have to look back. The Habsburgs believed in keeping power within the family. They didn't trust outsiders, and instead chose partners who were often close relatives. Over time, this led to serious health problems across the family. Faces started to look eerily alike, and the famous Habsburg jaw wasn't just a family trait. It made chewing and speaking difficult. Physical and mental illnesses became common, but they were often ignored or explained away. By the 1600s, the Spanish Habsburgs were more closely related than siblings. The dynasty had pushed its bloodline to the breaking point. Charles II's mother, Marianne of Austria, was both niece and wife to the previous king. Their genetic match was so close. Scientists today say it was more extreme than the bond between a parent and child. When Marianne became pregnant, the court celebrated, but the baby she delivered was not the future they had hoped for. From the moment he was born, Charles showed severe problems. He didn't move or cry. His skin looked pale, and when he did make a sound, it wasn't a cry. It was a faint, wet gasp. Doctors tried to reassure the family, claiming he'd grow stronger in time. But it was already clear this child wasn't just unwell. He was a result of centuries of misguided decisions. Still, he was given royal titles. He was dressed in fine clothes and declared Spain's future. But in truth, Charles was born into a role his body could never fulfill. As a baby, he couldn't nurse. As a child, he couldn't chew. He drooled constantly and had trouble swallowing. His first teeth didn't come in until he was nearly 4. He didn't walk until 5, and when he did, it was with great difficulty. The palace whispered about miracles, but behind closed doors, the truth was harder to hide. Tutors described him as unfocused, unable to learn, and sensitive to sounds and light. He often stared blankly or fixated on tiny details in his clothing. He rarely responded to questions. At times, he became suddenly aggressive, hitting servants, pulling at his clothes, or chewing on furniture. One diplomat described him as barely human. Another said he wouldn't live long. But Charles kept going, not because he got stronger, but simply because his body kept surviving. His mother, Queen Marianne, handled most royal decisions in his name. She kept tight control over who could interact with him and often spoke for him. Charles became more of a symbol than a ruler, displayed in public to maintain the illusion of stability. Court life adjusted around the illusion. His rooms were constantly cleaned to hide infections. He couldn't control his bowels, but portraits painted him as confident and regal. The truth was airbrushed away. He was shown with strong features and a dignified look, but in reality, he could barely hold his head up. The palace kept the act going. Ministers and servants played along. If Charles stared blankly, they said he was deep in thought. If he spoke nonsense, they called it unique wisdom. They lied to themselves and to the world, clinging to the image of a healthy king. Foreign visitors were shocked. One French envoy said the king horrified him, and worse was how everyone pretended nothing was wrong. At feasts, Charles would sit motionless, unable to feed himself. Musicians performed for a king who barely noticed. Once, a court performer made a joke that the kingdom was ruled by a corpse. By morning, he had vanished. The royal court wasn't just managing a sick king. They were trying to keep an empire from falling apart. Ministers argued. Nobles fought for influence over Queen. Religious groups began to believe Charles was cursed. Some said he was possessed. Others thought he was the cause of Spain's growing misfortunes. Charles was at the center of it all, a silent figure around whom an entire system was collapsing. His days were tightly controlled. He was never left alone, never allowed to walk far, never told the full truth. Mariana ran the kingdom behind the scenes. She decided who spoke to her son, what he read, what decisions he supposedly made. She even read letters for him. Charles was a puppet, and she was the one pulling the strings. Still, the court held on to hope. They prayed he'd marry and produce an heir. But Charles's condition was no secret to the foreign princesses brought to meet him. One reportedly fainted upon seeing him. Another refused to take off her gloves, afraid even of touching the air around him. But the royal court kept smiling. They kept saying, "Long live the king," because admitting the truth would unravel everything. By the time Charles turned 20, the whispers about his health and the future of the monarchy were growing louder and impossible to ignore. They called him the bewitched king, El Hechizado, as if his condition could be blamed on curses rather than generations of intermarriage. His health was clearly failing, and not even the court's elaborate rituals could hide it. His jaw often hung open, drool trailing down his chin. His hair came out in handfuls. His skin turned a sickly yellow. His eyes no longer seemed vacant. They looked trapped, darting around as if searching for a way out of his own body. Yet he was still king, still dressed in velvet, still wearing a crown. And so the court created another illusion, marriage. Maybe, they hoped, he could father an heir and continue the royal line. They arranged for him to marry Marie-Louise of Orleans, the teenage niece of France's King Louis XIV. She was 17, bright, lively, and completely unprepared for the life awaiting her in Spain. On their wedding night, Charles waited in bed, nervous and unsure. Accounts vary. Some say he cried. Others say he simply stared until someone was brought in to explain what he was supposed to do. But no child came of that night, or any night after. Doctors tried everything. Herbal mixtures, ground pearls, even bizarre remedies like powdered deer parts. Nothing worked. Priests offered prayers. Surgeons performed humiliating exams. But the problem wasn't something they could fix. Charles was sterile. His body simply wasn't capable of creating life. Marie-Louise withered in that environment. She stopped smiling, stopped eating, and eventually died at just 26. Officially, it was from an intestinal issue. Unofficially, many said she died of misery. Charles was devastated. He sobbed at her funeral and even asked to sleep beside her coffin, believing she might wake up. Within a year, the court arranged another marriage, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess known for her strong will and fertile family line. She came with priests and midwives, ready to fulfill her duty. But again, months passed. There was no pregnancy, no child. She too began to lose her spirit. Meanwhile, Charles continued to deteriorate. By 30, he looked elderly. His bones were soft, his teeth fell out, and he needed his food pureed. Servants had to spoon-feed him while reciting prayers. He couldn't control his bowels. He couldn't read or remember much. Still, he wore the crown. With doctors helpless, the palace turned to religious rituals. Physicians were replaced with exorcists. They doused him in holy water, performed chants, and burned herbs in his room. One priest claimed a Moorish spell had been placed on him as punishment for the sins of his ancestors. No one dared mention science. No one brought up genetics. The truth was too dangerous. Charles wasn't cursed. He was the inevitable result of centuries of inbreeding. He wasn't just a victim. He was a symbol of everything the Habsburgs had ignored. And still, he sat in the center of a crumbling empire. Every breath was treated like a sign from heaven. Every slight movement interpreted as progress. Spain had no backup plan, no successor. so they wrapped his decline in ceremony. He became less a ruler, more a relic, an object of devotion that had to be protected at all costs. Mirrors were kept from him. No one wanted him to see his reflection. Courtiers spoke to him gently, told him he was chosen, blessed, and whether he believed it or not, he played along. When all you've ever known is illusion, truth becomes frightening. By age 30, it was clear. Charles was dying, slowly. His body had been falling apart since birth, yet he remained alive, just as Spain hung on, deteriorating but still standing. The palace filled with whispers. Everyone wanted to know who would take the throne when he finally passed. There were no children. His first wife had died without an heir, and his second marriage wasn't going any better. Her family was famous for producing sons, but even that wasn't enough to fix what was already broken. So the court turned again to faith and superstition. The queen ordered a spiritual investigation. Monks examined everything, from Charles's clothes to the ashes of his first wife. Rumors spread that poisoned chocolate, or even Satan himself, had cursed the king. Charles, lost in confusion and fear, believed it. He slept with holy water, wore charms, begged for healing. But nothing changed. Charles II was a final product of a dynasty obsessed with bloodline purity. Sick, childless, and mentally fading, he ruled in name only. His death in 1700 ended Spain's Habsburg line and sparked a brutal war. He left no heir, only a shattered empire and a warning history won't forget.